Welcome to the Personal Development Mastery Podcast. Stand out, don't fit in. Today I have the real pleasure of speaking with Joze Piranian. Joze, after spending most of your life avoiding speaking almost entirely due to a debilitating stutter, you are now a TEDx speaker, the recipient of the International Speaker of the Year award in 2017, and a stand-up comedian who has performed in 3 continents and 3 languages. Last year, you had one of your talks going viral on social media and being viewed by more than 3 million people. And you have performed for the United Nations and have delivered your inspirational keynote at many organizations, events, and educational institutions all over the world. Joze, welcome to the show. I'm overjoyed to be speaking with you today.
It is so great to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
My real pleasure. And obviously, the first thing I want to start is your story. So specifically, I want 1 or 2 key defining moments that led you or changed your journey.
First of all, I'm happy you started with an intro. When people don't start with an intro, usually I have to address the fact that I stutter. I'll say something like, I'll tell people who are listening that their internet connection is fine. I take full responsibility for any perceived buffering that they experience on their end. In terms of your question, I would say one really big milestone on my journey was starting stand-up comedy. It allowed me to reframe how I perceive my stutter, how I perceive being different, and what was once a source of deep and painful insecurity and anxiety turned into something that I can joke about freely. It allowed me to take full ownership of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the big steps. A second one that I will mention now was competing at a speaking competition. It was the first time I got on a stage. I had done some public speaking previously at, I'm sure you've heard of Toastmasters. I had joined.
Well.
Yes, I would have expected that, and I had joined it initially as a challenge, but I had never done public speaking on a stage outside of that setting. In fact, when I was in my second year of university, I asked all of my professors to exempt me from presentations and from in-class participation. It was something I avoided as much as I could. When I did that speaking competition, I shared my story in a speech that I wrote called "To Speak or Not to Speak," and that was a very symbolic moment for me. So I would say those are two big moments that defined the the beginning of of the radical transformation that occurred over the past 3 years.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Jose, I want to go a little bit further back because you obviously on your TED talk you talk about that story where as a teenager you were holding hands with a girl and she didn't really appreciate the fact that you couldn't say your name and she left. So you said that you felt shame, embarrassment, and anger at this situation. I think you also said about hating yourself, which are very, very strong emotions. So my question is from this state of mind towards really shifting and changing and deciding that enough is enough. What happened? Was there a moment of decision? Was there something that made you say enough with that? I'm going to see it differently.
It's interesting you brought up that story. It seems like it resonates, or it stands out for a lot of people,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's because we understand each other's stories through emotions. That's the common language. And even though, for example, you might not have experienced the challenge of stuttering, that story, and then of course the emotions I talk about, shame, embarrassment, these are emotions that most people have experienced in one way or another, unless of course that person is a psychopath, then maybe they don't experience those emotions. So the question about, was that point a was that moment a turning point on my journey? I would say no. In fact, it was one of many negative experiences that just drove me towards deeper and and deeper avoidance, anxiety, and to some extent depression as well. So it was, I would say, I experienced a lot of these painful moments o- o- over many years
Mm-hmm.
before I started to take the necessary action. And I would actually sometimes take action by working on my stuttering, but that would not last long, and I would go back to avoiding people after after one negative reaction. Uh, I would go back to that state of avoidance. So it was a lot of
Ups and downs.
yes, of ups and downs. And even though I had learned this breathing technique to control my stutter a while ago, it took me many years to develop the confidence to express myself more openly, because with or without the proper technique to control the stutter, I still had to get over that initial obstacle of accepting that I am different and accepting that whenever I enter a social situation, this discomfort was going to be a part of it. And I had to accept that in most cases, people were going to react a certain way to me speaking differently.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Uh, so you talk about exposing yourself to the source of your fear, which was speaking in public with people, and you mentioned Toastmasters as well, and the university where you were in the debating club. So coming back to my question, was there any point where you started shifting towards that part of, looking at your fear in a different way more than actually wanting to avoid in it? Maybe not a moment as such, but I'm just trying to determine if there was some period or some event that tipped the scale and made you say that, okay, I'm going to work towards it.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, the debating club, in my last year of university, I I did start to take a few steps towards conquering that fear. And I believe the before this call began, you had mentioned Tony Robbins, and he, even though I'm not too familiar with his work, I had come across maybe a video or a quote where he talked about how change happens when the pain of staying the same is bigger than what
I
was
don't
the
remember
quote
it
again?
exactly. Yes, I don't remember, but I understand what you mean. Yeah, the pain of staying the same is more than the maybe the discomfort of changing or the
Yes,
uncertainty.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And I believe I was in a state of, I was actively engineering my life in a way that minimized speaking at all
Mm,
costs.
all right.
And I think I was constantly I was constantly missing out on opportunities and conversations and moments. I'll share one story that I haven't shared a lot before. It was okay, so it was in my psychology class that I took, even though I was I was getting a degree in business, I ended up getting a double major in psychology. And I am 100% convinced that the only reason why I was interested in psychology was because of my personal experiences with stuttering and with severe social anxiety and fears resulting from being different. And I took this one class called interpersonal relationships. And at some point in that class, the professor created this anonymous forum for the students to start conversations about relationships and about these types of topics. And I remember there was this one woman in the class who had really caught my eye, and I wrote on that forum. I wrote a post that said something like to the girl with the yellow hat or whatever she was wearing that day, you caught my eye. And then she did reply to that post in the in the in the in the anonymous forum. And then I suggested that after a few messages in the this wasn't private, so this all happened in the anonymous public forum with all of the students of the class. After a few messages, I suggested that we go for coffee and we set a time and place. She said yes. And then on the day of this date, I was just so terrified of going, and her finding out that I have a stutter, and me experiencing a potential rejection because of the fact that I am different, that I did not show up. And then I think she had actually sent a message that same day in the morning to confirm, and I never replied. And then about a week later, she revived that message and said, "Hey, I'm going to go for a drink with a few of the people from the class. Would you like to join us?" I never replied. And I think this, even though this story is about one specific situation, it also symbolizes how I lived my life overall. it was this constant dynamic of me wanting to experiencing things, and yet me allowing my stutter and all of the fears that were created as a result of it. I allowed this to hold me back in every way imaginable.
Holding back, that's the key word I get from what you said. And obviously, that really shrinks our potential for growth, for living the life that we can live, or our potential and our destiny. You talk about the when you talk about in your speech or in your speeches, how you redefined your relationship with fear, because from that situation you saw this internal battle. You were having all these negative feelings about your starter. You saw it in a different way. You redefined that, and I wanted to ask you about, because you motivate in your speeches and you inspire people to do the same, not necessarily with a starter, even though you mentioned that everyone has an inner starter that limits them. So, talk to us about redefining our relationship with fear and this inner starter that we have as an analogy, and what to do about it.
Yes, in my TEDx talk, I at some point I asked the audience if they felt fear before, if they've held back because of fear. I asked them to put their hand up, and the whole room had every person in that room had their hand up. And I said, I hate to break it to you guys. You all stutter. And whenever we allow something to hold us back from acting in a way that we would have wanted in the absence of that fear, that's what I define as a metaphorical stutter, so to speak. And I believe this can manifest in people's lives in various ways. Someone might want to speak up in a meeting at work and they just remain quiet out of fear of being judged. That is their stutter. Or they're at a gathering, which hopefully will get to experience social gatherings again soon. They might want to say hello to someone, and yet something just, the fear of rejection prevents them from acting on it. Or they want to start this new project and they just can't take the first step. There are a lot of ways that this inner stutter can manifest itself. And then the question is, how does one overcome it? I believe I'll share an anecdote. I was at I'm sure you know Mark Manson. He wrote wrote a book called, it's a very popular book. It's called the it's called the subtle art of not
Yes.
giving a fuck.
Yes. Okay. I haven't read the book, but I've seen it. It's one of those titles that catches your attention.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. He he had a book signing for his new book, which actually I recommend his new book to you because he incorporates a lot of ancient philosophy, and because you are Greek, I'm assuming you are a fan of philosophy. He incorporates a lot of Stoic. Yeah. Anyway, I was at a book signing of his here, just a few blocks away from my
Mm-hmm.
house in Toronto. And at the end of his talk, he asked who had question, who had a question to ask. As soon as he asked that, I started experiencing the physiological response to fear.
Mm-hmm.
My heart was beating quickly and I felt a bit dehydrated. I mean, all of those symptoms. And this is even though he had not asked me to ask, just the mere thought of having to ask a question in that moment in front of, maybe it was like 300 people, and it was a big event. And mind you, at the time I had already given a TED talk. I had done stand up before, so it wasn't like I had not done any public speaking.
Mm-hmm.
He asked who has a question. The fear starts to really, really, really hit me. And in that moment, the way I interpreted that fear was, uh-oh, I feel fear. Therefore, I must do this. And as soon as I went through that thought process, I put my hand up. And then I asked the question. And after that whole situation had happened, I felt amazing. I had done something that was literally terrifying. And what was interesting from that situation is, after the event, so many people came up to me and we had a conversation. And it it is also a nice reminder, symbolically, that when we conquer a fear, or when we do something that we are afraid of, quite often it opens new possibilities, and things that we did not expect to happen
Mm-hmm.
end up happening when we put ourselves out there.
Absolutely. You reminded me of that phrase that everything you want is on the other side of fear. And
Yeah.
indeed, you just have to cross that line, which is only an imaginary line. And it's only inside your head. There is no actual real danger. It's just a perception inside your mind that you mentioned the rejection or maybe humiliation, all these emotions that might arise from potentially, which usually they don't. Usually they don't, and you feel, as you said, you feel fantastic afterwards, and you have new opportunities, and yeah, all this comes.
And even if they do arise, even if the worst case scenario happens, it's a moment. It's a fleeting moment. I know one of the main exercises I did on my journey was I would go to the mall before lockdown, and I would, for a few years, I would go almost every week, and I would challenge myself by talking to 100 strangers. I would ask them for directions, or sometimes I would just tell them, "Hi, I have a stutter and I'm working on it today," by introducing myself to as many strangers as I can. It's an exercise I miss doing because it definitely would act quite rapidly and allow me to expand my comfort zones in such a drastic manner. In fact, that's an exercise I would do before most of my big performances with stand up and speaking. I would go to, even when I would be in another city for a talk or a stand up performance, a few hours before the talk, I would go outside and I would do this exercise to warm up psychologically. And you talked about how the worst case the worst case does not happen. Now, because I have a stutter, quite often my worst case scenario did end up happening. I would be asking a question to a group of people, and sometimes, especially when I'd be talking to a younger group of people, they would react to my stuttering with laughter. It has happened many times, which is technically the worst case scenario. And I have found one very liberating thought has been not acknowledging that the worst case does not happen, but it was exposing myself to the worst case scenario and realizing, and even though in the moment it is extremely painful and uncomfortable, I won't say that it's not. Once that moment is over and I've exposed myself to this worst case scenario, I would find that it would enhance my immunity to the world, and it would definitely strengthen my character in a way that was extreme extremely beneficial for my other endeavors, in, 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 including public speaking.
Mhm. Fantastic. Now, what you said about exposing yourself to the worst case scenario is actually, and because you mentioned the Stoic philosophy earlier, I remember reading about that as an exercise that some Stoics used to do to actually leave their worst fear, to go
Mm.
through it, and then they realize that it's not so bad as we perceive it in our mind. When you actually experience it, you say, "Is that what I was afraid of?" Because
Yes.
it's not going to kill you or anything. If anything, it just makes you stronger.
Yes. And it might be, it might be awful in the moment.
Hmm.
See, that is real. But once the moment is over, I think the key is realizing that we survived the fear. And even though the actual moment might be extremely uncomfortable, there is a certain liberation or wisdom to acknowledging that it is extremely uncomfortable, but it is also fleeting. And if something is fleeting discomfort, it should not it should not torment us,
Hmm.
because it is something that happens and then goes away. And in the meantime, we would have done something that is very positive for our lives in the long run.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Jose, there is one other thing I wanted to ask you, and then I have some quick fire questions for you as well.
Well, they won't
So,
be that quick.
somehow I was expecting that answer.
Fire will call them medium fire
Okay, fair
in the
enough.
case of our conversation.
So, before we go to the medium fire, I just wanted your comment. You talk about your adversity, and in your case, that your stutter, which you perceived, and many people would perceive, that this is a very unpleasant and unfortunate situation for you. But instead of that, it has become the main drive uh, behind your burning desire to destroy your fears.
Mhm.
And it has defined you as a person. So I wanted a comment on this.
Yeah, I think the uh, ironic nature of this journey is that none of it would have happened in the absence of a stutter. I don't think I would have ever delivered a TEDx talk. I
Mhm.
would have never become a stand-up comedian, because it's not that I delivered a TED talk in spite of my stutter. It's not that I became a stand-up comedian in spite of my stutter. It all happened because of my stutter. And even if I dare say, thanks to my stutter and thanks to the fear that had become so paralyzing and so controlling, that I had to make a very simple decision. That fear was so powerful that it was going to act in one extreme way. I had to choose what way it was going to go.
Mm-hmm.
My whole life, it acted in an extremely negative way. And I find it is harder to go from extremely negative to neutral than to go from extremely negative to extremely positive. It's as though it has to act. It's this strong energy
Mm-hmm.
that had to be ch- channeled in one extreme way or an, another extreme way, and with one uh, one fear defying action at a time, things evolved from me avoiding people, avoiding speaking almost entirely, to me pursuing one scary endeavor after the other. I remember a few hours before I competed at that speaking event in front of 100 people, I was absolutely terrified. I was thinking, 100 people? What? I was just absolutely terrified. And then a few months after it was 200 people, and I was thinking, oh my God, are you kidding me? How on earth will I manage this? And then before my TEDx talk, I I learned that the event was expecting 500 people, and I was thinking 500. This this makes no sense. And in fact, the fear and the anxiety a couple of weeks before the TEDx talk were so strong that I was really I was really struggling with the stutter and the fear.
Mm-hmm.
I remember going to the mall, and I had told myself I cannot leave this mall until the fear is under control again. And I I start my exercise, but I was just so fearful and so controlled by the stutter and by the fear. I was I was getting stuck severely every few words, and I was getting some pretty bad reactions from people, including laughter, including people walking away as I was as I was getting stuck on a word for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. After about 10 or 15 interactions, I went to the side and I literally felt like giving up. I felt like crying.
Mm-hmm.
I I will be vulnerable here and say I did have some tears that 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 were that were running down my cheeks, and I was thinking I should just quit and go back home. This is way too uncomfortable. I just don't want to be here right now. It just felt beyond painful and uncomfortable. But then I, I knew that I had to give this TED talk in a few days. So I was thinking, no, I don't have the option to give up right now. And I stayed that day at the mall for 8.5 hours. I talked to more than 200 people, and I felt like I had gained control over it again. And that's the part that not a lot of people will see. Obviously, when I'm on stage, quite often I will feel confident thanks to all of the work I have done behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And what was your question again? Oh yeah,
Yes.
yes, yes. I just remembered
Mhm,
because
mhm.
you had phrased it you had phrased it using the word burning desire. So yes, I would say it definitely it's a it's a thin it's a it's a very it's I have found that extreme fear and extreme motivation are very closely related. And what I often say is that my fear did not go away even after hundreds of comedy and speaking engagements. What has changed is my relationship with that fear. Whereas in the past, that fear acted as a roadblock. Today, that same fear has acted or acts as a trampoline that propels me forward.
Mhm.
And that's how I think the same obstacle can act either as a paralyzing agent or as a catalyst. And we get to decide which way it goes. It is not an overnight decision, it's a series of a million micro decisions where it's like a binary uh, it's like a binary model where we have to keep on selecting one instead of zero
Mhm.
over and over again until it becomes a way of life to naturally gravitate towards the one and not the zero, even if the circumstances make it way easier and way more convenient to go for the zero.
Mhm.
This is the first time I express it with this uh, analogy.
Mhm. This is also a very good takeaway from one of them, anyway, from the conversation, that the same fear, the feeling of fear, can either paralyze you and keep you on your tracks doing nothing, or it can propel you or springboard you towards taking action to see what's on the other side of it. That's
Mhm,
fantastic.
mhm.
Let's go with those medium fire questions as well. So,
Mhm.
Jose, what does personal development mean to you?
redefining obstacle, rewiring fears and self-limiting beliefs, and lastly, living in alignment with our potential.
That's awesome. If you could go back in time and meet your, say, your 20-year-old self, what's the one piece of advice you would give him?
Okay. It's okay to be different. I battled with that idea my entire life, and I think it's only when every time I even say this sentence, I get I get I I get weirdly emotional because it had been a challenge my entire life, not wanting to accept that I am different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think accepting it is the first step. And it's not just perhaps accepting that we are different, perhaps a more in, in, a more inclusive way of ex, of expressing it is accepting who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And this I think was a key step for me, which was definitely accelerated through comedy.
That's great. And Jose, if you had a magic wand and you could change something in the world as it is today, what would that be?
Hmm. I'll say the first thing that comes to mind, even though there are a million things that I'm sure I'm going to think later, oh man, I should have said that thing instead. The first thing that comes to mind within the context of this conversation would be heightened empathy.
Mm, beautiful. Is there anything you were hoping I would ask you today and I completely missed it?
It felt like it felt like a very complete conversation. It felt as though I relived so many moments of my life in just 1 hour. It
Mm-hmm.
did feel like a trip, a voyage, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I expressed what I would have wanted to express and share in terms of my story and the insights I want the listeners to have.
Thank you. And tell us how can people connect with you and find out more about you. And I'll also mention in this saying this that I'm going to put the link to your TEDx talk on the show notes. And as I told you before we started recording, it when I watched it, it moved me, and I'm sure that you've heard that many times. So tell us how can people connect with you.
I really appreciate that. How can people find me on Instagram? It's at Yesway Joze, Joze, and they can find me as well with my full name on LinkedIn. I also have a page on Facebook and YouTube with my full name.
Awesome. Joze, I want to thank you very much for your time, for sharing all these empowering and inspiring messages with me and the listener of the podcast. I want to wish you all the very best. Any final parting words?
Thank you for having me. It was a very genuine conversation, even though we have not spoken face to face before. It does feel as though we've known each other for a long time. I'm sure you've heard this before. Yeah, you have a very genuine energy, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to staying connected.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Joze, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review Personal Development Mastery on Apple Podcasts. If you want to know more about me and how I can help you, join my Facebook group Personal Development Mastery. The link is in the show notes, or you can simply type bit.ly/PDM group. And until next time, stand out, don't fit in.